Welcome to SunScream, a spooky evenings production. Tonight's guest on SunScream is New York Times best-selling author Grady Hendrix. Grady writes fiction, also called lies, and he writes nonfiction, which people sometimes accidentally pay him for. He is the author of Horror Store, My Best Friend's Exorcism, Paperbacks from Hell, and the latest book, The Final Girl Support Group. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our guest, Grady Hendrix. Welcome, sir.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I'm sorry you're looking into my office. It looks like a hoarder's basement.
Actually, I mean, it kind of looks like what I expected it to after reading Paperbacks from Hell.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately. It's a lot of junk right now. I was just resorting out a bunch of paperbacks that I picked up, and it's just there. And I sort of have pulled a bunch because I'm reading a lot of murder books right now to put together a show for Final Girl Support Group that I'll be using to promote it in July when it comes out. So I'm reading everything with serial killers and that kind of thing in it. So it looks terrible. So I apologize.
So you're kind of living the life of one of your book club members in a way.
I hope not, because that means I end up dead, I think. Or
They didn't all die.
yeah, that's true. Some died. Others committed murders and dismembered a corpse, which I'd
Dismemberments,
like to
very,
avoid.
very gory dismemberment. I have
Yeah.
to congratulate you on that. That is definitely one of the more bloody scenes I think I've read outside of the elevators in The Shining.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me see. Hold on. Oh, so a friend of mine from high school is a food photographer, and a while back I bought this book he did called A Field, which is about sort of killing and dressing your own deer and wild hogs and birds and stuff. Like sort of a game cookbook, and I bought it just to be a nice friend. And then when I was writing Southern Book Club, I was like, "What are they gonna do with this body?" I was like, "Oh, I happen to have this book that's all about how to dismember a corpse." Essentially. So it's the same technique.
Well, it's interesting because we're skipping way to the end of the book here. So it is interesting because they tack up like a diagram in the
Oh yeah,
bathtub.
sure. Well, I mean, how else are you going to remember it? I feel like, it's funny. I feel like people give characters in books this sort of superhuman powers that they don't have in real life. Like I wouldn't remember what part to cut off next, like unless I
Definitely
did it
not.
like a lot.
Well,
Which you
that's
sort
the
of hope
interesting
you
thing
don't.
because James seemed to know just by looking at it. So maybe
Oh
he
yeah,
did know.
well, I mean, you look at a picture of a deer with sort of the dotted lines on it, and you can kind of figure out what's going to happen to you next. Nothing good.
Nothing good. I mean,
Whenever you're in a tub and people have chainmail gloves and they tack up a picture of how to field dress a deer, that's not going to be a relaxing bath.
it had echoes too of Night of the Living Dead to it, in terms of like
Oh,
body
how
parts.
so?
Just
Oh
body
yeah,
parts
yeah,
still
yeah,
moving after they'd been removed.
yeah. Yeah. Did you say night or return?
I said night.
Oh, okay. Are they still moving in night?
I thought they were like maybe they're not. If they don't
They
shoot him in the
might.
head, I thought that they.
Yeah, they might have. I can't remember. I haven't seen Night in a while. I should
I might
rewatch
be
it.
mixing up the '90s version and the original version
Yeah, well,
too.
definitely Return of the Living Dead has the whole thing. I mean, it's one of the best movies ever made, but it has the whole thing with the rabid weasels when they chop up the body and put it in the plastic bags and take it next door to the crematorium and tell them it's rabid weasels and they need to incinerate them.
You're a great consumer of all things horror. I've come to conclude.
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's an advantage or a disadvantage. And I really didn't read much horror as a kid. I thought the covers were generally too gross. So a lot of it's catch up reading. I mean, the movies I watch, because that's what you did with your friends.
Sure.
And I rarely watch them on my own. I usually watch them with the group. But the books are mostly catch up reading. And there's a lot of movies because I wasn't really allowed to see R-rated movies for a while when I was a kid. And so so a lot of my viewing, I would read about a movie in Fangoria and then kind of convince myself I'd seen it. So like I thought I'd seen Friday the 13th part 2 and then I was doing what I thought was rewatching it a couple of years ago. I was like, oh wait, I'm seeing this for the first time, um, which was weird because the beginning of that movie has a lot to do with why I wrote Final Girl Support Group, because I just thought what they did to Adrienne King at the beginning, she survives part one and then here she is in part two and she's trying to put her life back together and, doing all the right things. And they just sort of knock her off sort of in this offhanded fashion, which I always thought was like incredibly cruel. Like maybe you can survive the mass killer, but you can't survive the sequel. Like the forces of market capitalism are just arrayed against you.
That happens in several horror movies, right? You survive, you make it to the end. I'm
And
thinking,
get killed in the sequel. Yeah,
yeah,
it's I mean, they kind of do it between Nightmare 3 and 4, where the character played by Patricia Arquette gets played by a new character in 4 and then knocked off pretty early. And I mean, you could say it's sort of like an Alfred Hitchcock Psycho Janet Leigh switcheroo. You think it's the main character and then they die, but really I just think they don't want to cut a better deal with the actress, and it's easier to kill them.
that's ostensibly why Halloween 3 was made, was it not? Basically, she dies because Jamie Lee Curtis's agent couldn't come up with a figure that the studio wanted.
Well, with Halloween 3, there was also that may have been part of it, but there was also the thing that Deborah Hill and John Carpenter really didn't want to keep making Michael Myers movies. And so
Right.
they wanted to do something. They wanted to turn it into an anthology series. And, that didn't work. Although the
No.
Halloween 4 has its charms. Um, Although I really like H2O as well. But that's
Do you
another really.
really?
Yeah, I do. It's fun. I just rewatched it. It's Jamie Lee Curtis is great in that. And it's again another thing where they do a really cruel thing where she has this great ending with Michael Myers at the end of that movie. And, she had this deal ostensibly with Mustafa Akkad that this would be the last Halloween movie. And what else can he do but make Halloween movies? He's not going to make the last one. And so in the next one, which I think is 8, um, they just rewrite the ending of Halloween H2O, which is a really stupid title, and really turn it into this sort of orgy of cruelty, where instead of having this like climactic moment with her brother, she's just murdering this poor helpless paramedic. It's really a mean thing to do. Women don't get treated well by the producers of slasher movies.
No, not at all. I mean, it's interesting too, because I'm working on a book on the 90s and horror movies. Um, and it
Oh,
is interesting just to
movies
see.
or TV too?
I'm just doing movies.
Okay.
But no, it's interesting you bring up TV as well, because when I was thinking about you and thinking about the books you consume and sort of like, for lack of a better phrase, things you like to wallow in. I was thinking he must have like a profound appreciation for certain types of television.
Well, it's funny. I really feel like the 90s was really, really interesting. And you'll know more than I do about this, but the 80s into the 90s, especially in publishing, horror really flamed out. I mean, the books just got, everyone wanted to be Silence of the Lambs, but
Mm.
the books just got gorier and gorier and the covers got more graphic. And there was just this huge overproduction glut. And it sort of all just, and then everyone started like, marketing what was horror as thrillers because no one was buying horror because it was just crap at that point. I actually talked to a writer who couldn't sell his horror novel. I think it was like 93. And so he just literally changed the word vampire to serial killer and sold it. And, so it was, the books really went downhill fast. And the movies, I don't think went as downhill as people say they do, but I know there was this perception that the movies got crappy. But I really feel like TV picked up a lot of that slack. You had Buffy and X-Files and then Millennium later. And I feel
Yeah,
like that
Twin
pulled it.
Peaks too before that.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like it pulled in a whole different horror fan, like a lot more women and a lot
Mm.
more people who were getting used to like, oh, horror doesn't just have to be gross and killy. Horror can be romantic. Horror can be funny. I feel like it really actually sort of seeded a whole new wave of horror that we're kind of living in now, because those kids who grew up in the 90s are now, in their 30s and 40s. So I don't know. I mean, does that hold up with your stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'm reading sort of like contemporary culture back into the 90s where it was
Mhm.
gestating. So I'm like doubly in vampire land because I reread Southern Book Club, and I'm writing about the '92 Dracula. Uh,
Oh yeah, which is a
and
great movie.
yeah, but it's so not the book, right? That's the
No,
funny
I know.
thing. And it's
Well, and
funny
I
because
love,
Coppola goes out of his way to talk about how it's the book.
yeah, well, it's so not the book. And I love the cover of the novelization because it's like, you know, Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola and whoever the screenwriter is, as adapted by Fred Saber. It's like, Jesus, how many authors can you get into this?
Well, James Hart, that's the scriptwriter, he had
Yeah,
peddled it forever as a TV movie.
really? I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
And it was
He
Winona
to-
Ryder who decided she wanted to do the movie, and she kind of owed Coppola a favor because she'd backed out of The Godfather 3.
Godfather 3, yeah. Well, I mean, let's hear it for Winona. Like, I mean, I think that was Coppola's last, well, maybe The Rainmaker did well, but I thought that was his last big hit.
Mm-hmm. And it was his
And it's
comeback movie too.
yeah, and it's a great movie. I mean, it's I don't know. I think the biggest problem with that movie is Keanu Reeves' accent is up front because I actually don't mind his performance and his accent's just dreadful. And I feel like if that had been later in the movie or he didn't have that accent, people would be a lot kinder to it in retrospect.
They'd actually wanted Coppola wanted Johnny Depp for the role, but the studio thought that Keanu Reeves had better sex appeal.
I think at that time they weren't wrong. I mean, at that time, wasn't Johnny Depp just sort of a Tim Burton weirdo dude mostly?
Yeah, I mean, he had sort of transitioned from TV. I mean, he started in Nightmare, obviously.
Yeah. So
But
what had he done by that point? Benny and June?
yeah, and Edward Scissorhands.
Yeah, I can see why they went with Keanu.
Mhm.
And
Uh,
also, let's face it, Jonathan Harker is a dumb part. I mean, like, I don't know if you saw that Dracula miniseries the BBC did.
oh yeah. Oh
Yeah, well, I thought each episode was worse than the one before, so I
yes.
actually kind of liked the first one, and but I was like, yeah, this really plays up the fact that the Jonathan Harker role is just stupid. It's just a dumb part. Like he's an idiot.
He becomes really in the book. He becomes so homicidal by the end.
Yeah, and like really just depraved, and like he's not. But the beginning, he's just such a wet blanket. He's just like, meh, 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 meh.
Well, he
You
definitely
know,
misses like any possible clue that the
that
old
any
Lost in Space robot going danger.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually think it's really interesting and stupid all at once that the 1931 Dracula puts Renfield in the Jonathan Harker role, because that actually makes narrative sense. Like it finally justifies sort of Renfield's existence. And which is great, but it gives Jonathan Harker even less to do.
Yeah. Well, it's because in this in the '92, right? You have Renfield is such a weird character to the film.
Well, it's Tom Waits, right?
Yeah.
And does he do anything, or does he just gibber about the master and eat
Well, I
bugs?
think because if you watch it, the first contemporary scene, right, in 1897, after the credit sequence, so after we get the weird backstory,
Yeah.
it's him. So the first person you hear talking in the contemporary time is him. He's like talking in the darkness to Dracula. And I think what it implies is that he actually set it all up. And he told Dracula about Mina, and he told him where to find her. Because how else would he have known?
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, that makes sense.
So now I'm gonna make a transition here to
Yeah,
yours,
yeah,
because
sure.
obviously you say in your prologue that Southern Book Club is your mom versus Dracula.
Yeah, I mean, roughly.
Yeah.
I mean, the same way you might say to someone, "Your mom." Like, it's not literally my mom.
Well, a
It's
woman
women
like your
of
mom.
that. Yeah, my mom's all right.
Well, what I'm getting at in terms of that is your book actually hymns not too unclose to Dracula.
Yeah. Well, I really there were only two books. I like usually when I write a book, I there's a couple I do a lot of research, but a lot of my books take place in the past or, I'm just idiotic that way. And so most of my research is on like setting, clothes, stuff like that. And then usually I'll read one or two books and then I'll read a lot, like with Southern Book Club, I read a lot of vampire books after I did Southern Book Club to put together a show to promote Southern Book Club when I went out on the road, which never happened. So I turned it into a podcast. So it's like doing Final Girl support group. I didn't rewatch any slashers or read the books to write that book. I wrote it and now I'm reading all that stuff to put the show together. So with Southern Book Club, there were two books I read. One was Montague Summers, The Vampire in Europe, because he wrote two vampire books. I think this one was The Vampire in Europe, which is his sort of collection of the folklore and stuff. And the other was Dracula. And so those were the two that really, and then I read a ton of books, like the books the book club read and all that, but those were the only two vampire books I read. And then afterwards I read a lot more. But yeah, so the Dracula thing is no mistake. And you know, I think it's a great book that still holds up and is really, I don't know. It's hard to say it's underrated, but I think it's underrated.
It's definitely, I mean, it definitely is. I'm actually teaching a class on the book next year, and yeah, it's got so much in it. The more you like go through it and
Yeah.
dig into there is so much.
Well, and it's also really interesting to me how, I mean, it can have any number of readings and all of them are fun, you know, like there's all kinds of fun readings with Dracula. But to me, the obvious surface level stuff is the stuff I find really compelling. I mean, the fact that every single vampire is a woman except for Dracula, you know, I mean, that's crazy. The fact that Mina is so absolutely amazing in that book. I mean, really, I really do think, and I mean, even though technically you could argue about it a lot, I really think she's sort of horror's first final girl in a lot of ways, in the sense that she's a strong woman who's alert, aware, the first one to detect danger, the first one to put the pieces together. And then she suffers really unconscionable cruelty throughout. But everything Dracula does to defeat her or stop her just makes her stronger. Like every disadvantage she turns into an advantage and really kicks his ass. So I really feel like, you know, in terms of strong women in horror, Mina Harker is what it all goes back to.
The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen kind of picks up on that
Yeah,
too.
absolutely. And you know, my problem with her portrayal in that is she's great, but I feel like Alan Moore leans a little too hard into Mina Harker as a ball buster. You know what I mean? And League, I love her in that. I like League. It's really terrific. But like, she's just a little too much of a ball buster in that. And you're like, come on, man. She is actually a human being and not this kind of like, you know, jerk.
It's interesting. So you do like a late 11th hour kind of number that I feel like Dracula also does, and it's very similar. It's the scene with Corey when Patricia walks in and catches James biting her, essentially very
Yeah.
sexual scene. And you have that scene also in Dracula too, right? You have the scene
Yeah.
where the crew of light is the theoretical term for them, burst into the room. Jonathan's passed out, and Dracula's forcing Mina to drink his blood.
Yeah.
And so I
Well,
find those scenes very similar.
yeah, no, and that was intentional. You know, that scene with Corey and James Harris and Patricia was really there from an early point. And it's interesting. Usually, when I write a book, I have a lot of scenes I want in there, and I write a draft. I think it's really good, and then it just sucks. And then most of the stuff I wanted in there comes out because really what people want is a character going start to finish. And when you're just putting in cool scenes and set pieces and neat stuff you think will have happen, you lose track of your characters and you don't dwell over the emotional beats, which is what people want, or what I think readers want. But that scene with Corey was always in there from the beginning because I couldn't think of a more gruesome betrayal or a moment where he's more revealed for what he is, which is a predator, you know, and a narcissist. And there was versions of the book where he and Patricia had a very sexual love affair. There were versions of the book where they were very close. There were all kinds of versions of the books, but always that scene was there because it's such a betrayal.
I mean, as a vampire, James slash Hoyt, uh, does he have another name, by the way? Is there a name
Oh,
that was
tons,
earlier?
tons.
Okay.
Yeah, so many names.
I figured you had like a weird genealogical tree for him.
Yeah. I mean, and he's ultimately Serbian, going all the way back. But yeah, I mean, so he doesn't even remember what his name was to start with. Like, I can't
Um,
remember what I did 10 years ago. He's got like 500 years. What does he remember?
he's a vampire in so many ways, though. It's so many of the traditional ideas of like what a vampire will do. It's not just the Dracula way. It's also just like the deceitful
Yeah.
vampire, right? The predatory vampire that's beyond drinking your blood. There's so many different levels, I
Yeah.
feel like, to that.
Well, that's like, part of what I really like to do is sort of take these things. I mean, how many toys are in the horror toy box,
Yeah.
But I like to take them and sort of be like, okay, what makes this tick? Like if I scrape away all this extra stuff, what's there? And really with vampires, I mean, they're predators, they're serial killers, That's what you get down to. They're the only monster that can pass for human. I mean, besides witches, I guess, but
Sure.
they're the only ones that preys on us, that looks like us, that you can't detect. And the thing that blew my mind is after I wrote the book, when I was doing all the research for the show, I hadn't realized there was that whole vampire and disease or pandemic
Mm.
connection, which I
Timeline.
find, oh yeah, it's really compelling. I mean, vampires were invented, or the real vampires, from
Mm.
the 17th century when they started digging them up in Serbia and stuff. They were invented to basically explain disease outbreak, and they would pop up where there were these outbreaks, because how else do you explain it? Something keeps
Mm.
getting into your house every night, and the young people and the old people get sicker and weaker and then die, and like you can't stop it. And it seems to be focused around graveyards, and which are unsanitary because they're full of diseased corpses. And it's just, and then you get into this whole thing in America where we were staking vampires in New England all the way up to like 1898, digging up their corpses and staking them over tuberculosis outbreaks, which was a huge killer. And then you look at Dracula, the movie, and which was really sort of the first American horror film in 31. And you realize that the big, huge horror movies before Dracula were venereal disease films, and you look at that stuff in Dracula, and those were hugely popular. And you look at and Carl Limley Jr. was an enormous germaphobe who actually lined his underwear with sanitary napkins because he didn't want germs to get on his dick and like rot it off. And you look at those scenes where there's a scene where Jonathan Harker goes to kiss Mina in the 31 Dracula, and she's like, no, you can't touch me anymore. We can't do that. I'm dirty. And you're like, and she's like, doctor, explain to him, dude, you find identical scenes in some of these VD movies with identical language. It's a craziness. And you look at Renfield going to, Europe at the beginning, and the brides come in and they look like Theda Vara vamps with the dark circles around their eyes and the shellacked hair and the short little bobs, and they're doing that Theda Bara like vamp look where they put their chin down and look up. And Theda Bara's first play, which became a movie, which became popular, she played the vampire, a sexually predatory woman who drained a dude of all his money and all his energy and humiliates him in front of his family. And all the VD movies were about they all came out of World War I, when all these men would come into basic training and they're like, holy shit, half our army has syphilis because they don't know what to do. And we're going to send them to Europe, where all these European whores who hang around these military bases are going to give them more syphilis and gonorrhea. And so these movies are about watching out for predatory women. I mean, it's just like, trust me, my office, you think it looks crazy now, it was like a serial killer. It was like a red yarn connecting all the dots behind me.
I think, I mean, because you said it in Charleston, obviously, where you're from.
Yeah,
And what's
because
interesting
I'm
about it is
obsessed.
say what?
Like everyone from Charleston, I'm obsessed with being from Charleston. It's so
Okay.
creepy.
I'm from Virginia, so I'm not quite as deep as the South, but you know how the weirdness gets when you start talking about the history of the South.
Exactly.
So it's interesting because I mean, you create at times vibes that you get in sort of like a Midnight, the Garden of Good and Evil. You
Mm.
create some Flannery O'Connor kind of vibes at
Oh,
times, like a
thanks.
Rose for Emily kind of situation when you're in the attic and you're finding things
Oh
you didn't
yeah,
want
yeah,
to
yeah.
find. Um, but it's interesting. I feel like having grown up in the South myself, of course this could happen in the South. Of course it
Right,
would, because you would not want your neighbors to think you thought bad of another neighbor. And of
right.
course that is a thing. Doesn't matter what's going on. The neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting, right? Because I don't think that's entirely unique to the South, but I think
No?
that's a unique perception to the South. You know what I mean? Like, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen Alice, Sweet Alice,
Hmm.
but I mean, dude, sort of Catholic Long Island, like that community, you could set something in there that would be just as dank and claustrophobic and inbred, but there's not this national perception of that. You know what I mean? But in the South, there is this perception that that's exclusive to the South. So yeah, it was fun to play off of that because I mean, it is this sort of, stereotype of the South. And it's not wrong, but I just think it's right also applies to a lot of other places.
Okay. I mean, I don't know. I've lived all over the country, and I definitely, even when I go home now, it's very much, what will the neighbors think? It's like, who cares what the
Oh
neighbors
yeah,
think?
yeah, yeah. Well, but I also think, depending on where you are in the South, I mean, there's a lot of societal pressure, and I don't know if that's true everywhere. I assume it is but I grew up in the South, so that's what I know. You know what I
Mm,
mean? So
I
those
do.
just happen to overlap there.
um, I did have a question for you. I've quite a few questions for you, but this one sort of puzzled me because this is the turn that the book didn't take that I thought it was going to take, was the bank account. So you
Mhm.
set me up kind of like in a Psycho kind of way. You gave me this whole MacGuffin thing that I would, and it's a bank account just like in Psycho. Uh, I thought for sure like that was what Patricia's great revenge was going to be. I thought she was just going to drain the
Uh,
account.
Yeah, no, I mean, the thing with the money in there was really for two reasons. One was I just felt like, what the hell? Like, how does a vampire get a bank account? Like,
Yeah.
just these practical questions. But the other was there was a thing that happened in the 90s that I thought was really interesting, which was that you looked at the beginning of the 90s and it was all these female singer songwriters from Beyonce with Destiny's Child to Amy Grant to Celine Dion to Ani DeFranco to everyone sort of got their start late 80s early 90s. You had the March for Women's Lives in the early 90s. You had more women coming into Congress than ever before. And then you get to the end of the 90s and it's real bro culture. It's boy bands and cock rock. It's, this rolling back of reproductive rights and this huge culture war is going on. And you look at the 90s and you're like, what kind of happened to us between A and B? Like how did it go from Walmart being in 32 states in 1991 to Walmart being the world's largest employer in 1999? How did it go from like there's CNN, and they show the news and it's pretty sleepy. It's like C-SPAN to there's Fox and CNN and,
Yeah.
reality TV and all celebrity court cases, all this stuff. At the end of the 90s, all this sort of rot came up and there was a real silencing of voices. There was a real pushback on women. I mean, Hillary Clinton getting demonized. The whole thing with Lorena Bobbitt, where an abused woman who like lashes out at her husband basically becomes a dick joke. There was this real pressure on women to sort of get along and accept porn, the porno aesthetic by the late 90s. If you look in magazines, like the pose you see most often with women is wearing a Donna Karan suit with a cigar and a glass of scotch. This real, this rebirth of cocktail culture and the Rat Pack thing. And I feel like what happened in the 90s was we just all made so much money. The economy boomed so hard. And there was this feeling of like, hush, don't just shh, just be quiet, just be quiet. Like, and disempowered groups, black people, children, women who were saying something's wrong here. Like, something's not good. The scoutmaster, the school teacher, the priest, the guy in my office, the cop, all these, but these people are doing things that are wrong. And the main pushback was, don't rock the boat. We're doing great. The stock market, we're all making so much money. And I think we're paying for a lot of that stuff now. And so I wanted money to be this thing in the book that really turned people's heads, that really got them flustered, that got them like sort of made them take leave of their senses, you know? I look at Charleston, where I'm from, and the 90s was really when development boomed, and people said,
Mm,
"Oh, people want to move here because it's so beautiful, and the water and the marsh, it's so gorgeous, and everyone wants to be here. So let's bulldoze that shit, put concrete condos up, and sell it to the people who want to move here because this stuff used to be there." Like, so it's just there was something really narcotic about money in the 90s. And the seeds for, you know, banking deregulation happened then, the seeds of 9/11 happened then, all this
mm.
stuff. Anyways, that was a really long-winded answer to a relatively straightforward question. So yeah, total red herring, sorry.
No, I appreciate. I mean, because I was also like, I was waiting to like Blue's obsession with Nazis too was another one
Mm.
that I was waiting to. I mean, because obviously App People came out in the '90s as
Yeah,
well.
well, you know, it's there was a little more to Blue's obsession with the Nazis in other versions of the book, in the sense that, you know, he's a kid. I mean, I was obsessed with Nazis as a kid, so that was part of it. But also, he's a kid and he's watching his family really fall apart in a lot of ways. And he's really identifying with people who are strong and don't apologize and look cool and look tough and look, you know, like as a little kid, I remember being obsessed with with the World War II until I got to the stuff about the Holocaust. I'm like, but before that, it's really cool looking, you know. And so the Nazis, and so it was easy as a 12 or 13-year-old kid to sort of blank out that less attractive part of Nazism, and really get caught up in like the way it looked strong, and the way it looked tough, and the way it looked like it didn't apologize and was very masculine. And so I had a part later with in with Ragtag dying,
Mm.
and Blue really like wanting to cry and not being able to, and sort of rejecting this toughness. And then I was like, A, I can't kill a dog in every single book, it's just too morbid, I don't want readers to hate me. And B, it just became too much of a sideshow about Blue, you know.
Yeah, it was. This leads to kind of another question because it seems to be a recurrent theme, at least. Do you hate therapists or psychiatrists?
You know, I don't hate them, but I've known some lousy ones in my time.
Clearly.
Yeah, no, and really socially, and you know, that's there's actually a therapist who once, I was at a dinner party and they were talking about how nothing worked but medication, how the talking cure, none of it worked. It was all just hocus pocus and making people feel good. Really, medication was the only thing that mattered. And I was flabbergasted that someone would just be so dismissive and high-handed. But I also tend to take a pretty dim view towards doctors in general. My dad's a doctor, and a good one, and I know lots of good doctors. But growing up around doctors, you know, you do realize that a lot of people go into medicine because they have a God complex,
Mm,
and they really want to. Defeat death, and it's really personal to them, and a lot of their ego is wrapped up in it. And so like I just don't I just don't buy it with a lot of these dudes. And so yeah, I love calling it out.
well, because I mean, Carter in some ways is just as bad as James.
I wouldn't say justice, he doesn't murder
Well,
anyone.
he's not actively murdering anybody. He's murdering
Yeah.
people's souls, perhaps, but
Right.
he seems to
But
be a
you
pretty ineffectual psychiatrist too.
yeah, well, you know, Carter's thing is twofold, and one is that he just grew up getting told he was great, you
Yeah.
know, and that he was a little prince. I mean, in China they call it the little god syndrome, of these like you know, only male children who get doted upon by their parents, and they grow up just to think the world revolves around them. And that's Carter. I mean, his mom was tremendous and made these enormous sacrifices and did this amazing thing to put him through school and live this life. And her son just feels like, well, yeah, I am amazing. I am worth all these sacrifices, which I think is a lot of I mean, I'm a only son in a family of four, and the youngest to boot. So, you know, I had my share of ego fueling and stroking as a kid. And was very, very aware and uncomfortable with the fact that every time someone would say something to my parents, like, "Oh, a boy, you must be so happy," or "You must have been so relieved to find out. It must have been so great to find," that it was always these things they thought were compliments were just such backhanded swipes at my sisters.
Yeah, and then you get, I mean, because the worst one, I guess, of your doctors is Warden Worth, uh, in terms of
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well,
being
yeah.
just absolutely demonic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's just, but this idea that this really, and it's an idea that was very prevalent and got put into action a few times with disastrous results. This idea of redeeming people by divorcing work from labor. You know what I mean? By divorcing labor from output, from production, I guess. That you did labor, but you weren't making anything. And I've had jobs like that where you're like, what am I doing? I'm writing up all this garbage, these reports and these emails and these things and these PowerPoint presentations. What are they doing? What do they do in the world? Nothing. And you just feel very helpless and
I didn't
very
realize you'd been a college professor.
I think that's become endemic in every job. There was someone who wrote this great essay about bullshit work. And I really realized that's an awful lot of the work we all do is it's bullshit work. It's creating stuff that serves no purpose. And I'm really lucky in that I've limit the ratio of my real work to bullshit work. I'm in a pretty enviable position, but it's still there's the bullshit work in there, and I resent it tremendously. And I find it very soul crushing, just to spend so much time on something that just and then I do a fair amount of screenwriting work, and that's a lot of screenwriting work. I mean, any screenwriter probably has dozens of pitches they've spent cumulatively hundreds of hours on that don't even get read. They just go somewhere and someone reads the first two sentences and that's it. The end.
It's funny. I worked at Disney for 2 years,
Ah,
and that was my relationship to
what were
reading
you
horror
doing
stories. I
there?
was a bartender.
Oh, wow.
Um, but yeah, I that was my relationship to reading. I was being traumatized into rethinking about sort of like the corporate speak of Disney,
Oh, I
which
can
you kind of like,
imagine it's
yeah,
super
but you
well
sum it up at
also.
the end, with the baby store. It's like
Yeah.
they all sound the same.
Well, and at the end of the day, that kind of management language is the same everywhere. It's all gone through legal, it's all gone through HR. And those are necessary things, but it all becomes very, very similar.
Yeah, it's because at one point, reading horror stories, you think, which is the more soul crushing? Because she has that moment too. Like Amy has that moment, right? Of which is the more soul crushing, descending into this ghost hell inferno and being
Yeah.
strapped to this chair, or my previous life of doing this tedious, redundant, dead end job.
Yeah. Well, my love of that kind of language really started because I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and I got obsessed with nuclear war in the 80s. Like my dad had this thing that he would just like randomly tell me that like Charleston was like in the top 10 targets for the Soviet Union if a war broke out, and we would die in the first 20 minutes. I was like terrifying when you're 8. And so I got obsessed with nuclear war. And we had these World Book encyclopedias that were like 20 years out of date. They were from the 60s. And they had all this stuff in the civil defense section, like, 30 pages on building a fallout shelter and the impact of a nuclear bombs. But there was all this euphemistic language, like mega kills and mega deaths and all this stuff and all this euphemistic language around nuclear war. And then I was a junior or senior in high school when the first Gulf War broke out, and there was all this language about uh what was it I'm losing my train of I'm losing the word, but collateral damage for killing civilians and things like that. And it really made me super sensitive to the way this sort of banal language cloaks these really bloodthirsty formulas. Like, I'm sure you got lots of training that was all about, like, in this very banal language, and really it was about, if someone gets drunk and walks out of the bar and murders someone with their car, we don't want to be liable.
Yep.
Like, that's what it boiled down to. But I'm sure it came to you cloaked in this sort of managerial language, which really hazes it. And
You would go to a double wide trailer and you'd sit in front of an old computer and you'd watch a poorly acted YouTube video, essentially, about
yeah,
liability. And you
yeah,
had to
and
do it
it
every 3 months.
yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, it's like it's all about death and responsibility and money. And it just gets cloaked and all this other stuff. And I've always just found that really this weird disconnect in modern life between what we say and what it's supposed to mean.
Now, it's interesting because you say of Southern Book Club, you say it's set in pretty much the same neighborhood as My
Mm.
Best Friend's Exorcism. I'm going to pose a third part because everything should be in a trilogy if it's in multiple parts. I am super curious about Leon Sims.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sure, sure.
And I'm like, there is a ghost story there if there ever was.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm actually right now writing the book for my book for 2022, which is set in that neighborhood, but a little further over. It's a little more of a blue collar part of that
Okay.
neighborhood called Old Mount Pleasant. And this book is about puppets and dolls.
Okay.
But yeah, no, the Leon. It's interesting. I've always really wanted to write a book, and I'm going to eventually. I have to convince someone to publish it, but there's a really interesting South Carolina story in upstate South Carolina in the 30s, 40s, and 50s with the labor movement. And that was a time when a lot of issues about class and race were all sort of overlapping. And when, there was a big textile strike down through there, and, they were bringing in people who were just machine gunning strikers, and they weren't allowed to be buried on church property. And there was just all this stuff going on. And unions were really trying to bridge the black white gap for labor solidarity. And it's just this really fascinating period of history where there are a lot of unsettled ghosts. I mean, there is a town in upstate South Carolina where I think 7 people were murdered during a strike, and they weren't allowed to be buried at the church because the bosses who contribute all the money to church, like, hell no, these people were striking at our factory.
It's
They
like
had to be buried.
Antigone.
Yeah, exactly. And they had to be buried out in the woods. And I mean, it's a state that's covered with slave graveyards. It's a state that's, and when you go back to it, slavery and all that stuff, growing up in the South, you always think of slavery as this sort of unique thing over on the side, right? You go to school, you study it, you study planet and all this stuff, and you don't get the connection that slavery was just work. You know what I mean? It was capitalism, or a part of the capitalist structure. It was just another economic model. And that a lot of things that we invented with slavery and to manage slavery are things that made their way into sort of the capitalist system. And it was hard for me to bridge that gap in my mind. And you realize that these plantations, I grew up thinking of these historic sites. They were factories, worked by human beings who were stripped of their rights because that was more efficient for the running of the factory. That increased the profit margins. And so it's really interesting to think about slavery moving up to the labor movement and that getting broken, and moving up till now, when you look at South Carolina, that's so economically devastated and so just mangled, especially in the rural areas with the economy. There's a story there that I'm not sure what it is quite yet. But it's one that I think there's something there.
I mean, because these are common motifs in your books, and in some cases your film screenplays. You get an interesting take on the female gaze. That's fairly repetitive in what you do. And I'm assuming in some ways that's growing up with mostly sisters that
Yeah, definitely.
formed that. You definitely have plays on class in your work. So you tend to dwell in one class or the other. Sometimes they go
Yeah.
visit, almost like going to the zoo, particularly in Southern Book Club. It's definitely like going to a very special kind of zoo.
Yeah, well, it was always weird when I was a kid. You'd go into a part of town or a part that you had just never seen in your life that was geographically very nearby. And you think, oh my God, like how is this so separate from my life? Like what is this? How did this happen? And it didn't happen by accident, you know?
It is interesting. I mean, I want to transition now, if we can, to the film Satanic Panic,
Oh yeah.
because I'm a big fan.
Oh, thanks.
And then I want to talk to you about slashers to
Mm.
wrap things up, because I know you want to talk about slashers as being your newest book coming out in a couple months.
Speaking of capitalism,
I
let's
know.
pimp the book.
Well, I mean, I'm sure. I mean, I enjoy your writing style, so I don't mind pimping this book.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
But yeah, so Satanic Panic, a bit different, but again, very sort of like class based. You have this girl who's a pizza delivery girl who gets very put upon in terms of
Yeah.
what she gets. My favorite scene is the guy with the couch.
Oh, right, exactly. Yeah, Code of the Sams.
Yeah, because I mean, as a bartender, again, I've experienced this. And then you get the big luxury McMansion that happens to be the hosting party of a coven trying to summon a demon to,
Yeah,
I guess, get more money.
of course. What else
Yeah,
is there?
yeah. You have some interesting set pieces in this. I'm curious which ones were in the origins and how much you decided to push things into more and more sort of like, I don't know, Hellraiser-esque absurdities.
Yeah, well, it's funny. There's two things, and actually, just a really quick segue. So, one of the things I say when people are like, oh, what's Satanic Panic about? I'm like, oh, it's a pizza girl, and she's delivering, pizzas, and there's a satanic cult of one percenters, and they're having a demonic ceremony to raise, Baphomet, and they order pizza because these things go on, and they be like, oh, ha, 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 that's why. Dude, did you read that oral history of killing Osama bin Laden?
Mm-mm.
It's just been making the rounds. And there is a whole section of it about ordering pizza because they're in the freaking situation room and they're like, we're going to be here for a while. We should order a pizza. And why can't the White House kitchen cook them a pizza? I don't know.
Yeah,
But they're like, we should order pizza. And then someone's like, no, guys. That's going to be gross. We're going to be in here and we should get something healthy. And so they order all these like crudité and dip platters from Costco and like sandwich wraps and stuff. And then halfway through the night, they're like, let's order the pizza. Like, what are we doing denying ourselves here? And then the next shift comes in and they're like, what the hell are all these disgusting Costco platters of like crudité? Like, where's the pizza? Like, pizza is essential for every human activity where you're bunkered up somewhere, whether it's raising a demon or killing Osama bin Laden, you need pizza.
Are you a fan of What We Do in the Shadows, the TV series?
I love What We Do in the Shadows. Yeah,
when he finally eats pizza.
Oh, and starts vomiting and I know that show's so great. And I had my doubts when I went into it, but it's really fantastic.
Well, the movie was good, so I had high hopes.
Well, I was like, oh, is this just going to be nailing that same joke over and over again? And yes, it is. But apparently that joke just is infinitely funny.
I enjoy the TV show more than the movie, actually.
Yeah, I do. Now, well, it's hard for two things are hard for me. One is I have a hard time with the movie now because Taika Waititi is such a icon now. And in the movie, when it first came out, his face wasn't that familiar.
Oh, yeah.
So it still felt fresh. So it's hard for me to go back to the movie now because I remember watching it the first time. I was like, oh, this fresh faced kid and he's in love with this old, oh my God, that's so great. And so, yeah, so I appreciate they replaced, the faces to go into the TV series. And Guillermo is fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
His timing is so good. But anyways, but the set piece that kills me with Satanic Panic, and it's one of those things that I wish we'd had the time, is the Kildo reveal.
That's what I was wondering about.
That was a tough thing to pull off. Well, there were two problems with the Kildo. One is the Kildo, we just didn't have the time and the money to do it right. And I wish I'd been on set, because I feel like that's something we would have realized. Like, and that's just one of those things with low budget movie making. Like, you have the time and the budget you have, and some things are harder to pull off than others. And that kind of like actual appliance, which look good, but to do it, and the potential nudity, and and sort of like the gags it needed, the stunt people we did a good job, but it needed to be great. And and so I feel like with comedy, almost is as good as not at all, you know what I mean? And I feel like it comes so close, and it's like, and so many other things nail it dead on with that movie, and that just like, and
Now, were you thinking about like Driller Killer, or were you thinking about
no,
Seven? Like,
it was sort of like a more Seven-ish thing, but it was
okay.
also like in the script, everyone was like, the Kildo in that script was, oh my God, the Kildo. On the page, that thing slayed. And when we got to the movie, another thing I didn't know, and this is on me, is that when it's a movie, what people want to see is two actors talking. That's really like gore, set pieces, all that stuff. What people want is it's the difference between a DC movie and a Marvel movie. Like, they both have big set pieces, they both have infinite budgets, they both have movie stars. But what the Marvel movies have that the DC movies don't is characters talking to each other.
Hmm.
And that really makes a difference. And when I saw Satanic Panic, and when I saw Mohawk with an audience, which I did one time each, because that's all I had the ability to withstand, because I'm nervous about this stuff, is when people were talking to each other, that's when the audience leaned forward and were engaged. And the Kildo is a gag. And the gag is supposed to be, and the gag is Amy, or oh God, what's
Sam?
her name? Sam, thank you, Jesus. Is Sam being like, what the hell is going on? But it's not a character gag. It's a prop gag. And and that was my bad. On the page, it slayed. In the movie, people wanted to see her interacting with another character. And so that I chalk that up for not working as well as I wanted it to. 70% me and 30% just timing and budget.
Okay. I mean, the actress, whose name I don't know, apologies. Oh, and if you haven't seen Satanic Panic, we're talking about a giant dildo that's basically a drill bit
Yeah.
that one of the sisters is wearing. Well, a footnote there. Go watch Satanic Panic on Shudder. I did that. Now my train of thought is gone.
Oh, you were saying the actress.
The actress carries it very well. I mean, like the dialogue is very
the main
snappy.
actress?
No, the one who's wearing the set piece.
Oh, yeah. No, they're great. I think they were local actors that they hired down in Texas where he filmed. And they were great. But, it's funny, watching that really also taught me so, like, what I'm very lucky that I'm getting to write movies that are getting produced, to learn how to write movies. Like, Haley, who is the lead actress who played Sam, like, on the set, like, she had a killer audition. And then on the set, like, there was this real, like, I don't know, man. I don't. And then once we saw her on screen, it was like, oh, that's what she was doing. Like, she immediately toned her performance way down during shooting. And like, people got worried. They were like, I don't know, man. Like, this is not what we saw in the audition. And then once you saw it on screen, you're like, oh, she's calibrated this not for the people watching the monitor and not for us. She's calibrated it for the camera. And it was really something really smart that I hadn't been aware of. And like Ruby Modine, who plays Judy, the other girl who's sort of her partner in the movie, her performance is so big that it played on set and on camera. But it was interesting that Haley did this very much more down. And I think it's because she's much more the straight man in the movie. And
Hmm.
she really realized that and realized that the more human she played it and the more she underplayed it, the funnier it was going to be and the better the reaction was going to be once it was on screen. And it gave me so, seeing her do that gave me so much respect for actors. You know what I mean? Just that, like, I am sure she was aware that people were concerned about her performance. And I really have to admire her sort of smarts to keep giving the performance that she needed to give, you know? It gave me a lot of respect for actors watching that movie and sort of going through production with them.
Yeah, I mean, it was an unexpected movie because when I came across it, I didn't know what to think it was going to be. And it's funny because I feel like you've created this interested, and I hate to use the phrase postmodern, kind of horror aesthetic that I feel like radiates kind of from you, because it's interesting that the flip side of yours, like the serious version of your, like serious version, the non-comedic version, let's say, because yours is a dark comedy, but the one that would be drained of all humor version of this is House of the Devil.
Yeah, totally, totally.
Um,
Absolutely. And and I love House of the Devil. It's still my favorite Ty West film. And so, but yeah, I see what you're saying. Absolutely. And I feel like, yeah, I think I just think I see the world funnier than Ty does. Like, it's like I was just talking to someone and like, the funniest stuff that happens to me is often right next to the worst things that happen. Like, my dad had a stroke earlier this week and he's in the hospital right now, and that's terrible and we're all very concerned. But he's also convinced he's on a cruise, and like he's really annoyed that he can't go up on deck because it's nice weather, and he keeps trying to get out of bed to go up on deck, and he's really mad about the service quality and like the food quality. And he's like, I paid a lot for this cruise and there's no, like, I don't get a menu, like what? And so on the one hand, it's very sad my dad's had a stroke. On the other hand, it's really probably the best way to be in the hospital with a stroke is to just be 100% convinced that you're on the world's shittiest cruise.
yeah.
So I think it's just, that's what I see, and I think it all comes down to sort of who you are as a person and how you see the world. And I think Ty sees the world much more seriously than I do.
Well, because I would say, like, in terms of like horror story, right? The Void is a very similar
Yeah.
situation, but it's again drained of like humor.
Yeah. Although great special effects.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Really. And those cult costumes are phenomenal.
Yeah, they definitely virally are one of the best films probably in the last decade.
Yeah.
And also just doing a lot with a very small budget.
Yeah. I
really
like
fantastic.
Manborg a lot more than I thought I would.
Okay.
Which is a lot of those guys too. Same crew.
Giving you some side eye. So
Manborg is not perfect. It has some great moments though.
If you really want to see what I mean, I don't know how, I'm a huge Joe Bob Briggs fan, so check out Hogzilla if you really want to treat.
Ooh. I've never even heard of it. Now I'm going to check it out.
Stars in it.
Wow. No, I'm definitely checking it out.
And it's more like his casino acting and not like his scare package acting. I don't know if you saw Scare Package.
No.
You should check out Scare Package. I think that would be right up your street.
Oh, totally. It's a great title.
Yeah,
I'm always jealous of good titles.
Basically, in like a blockbuster kind of situation, and they're talking about the different movies in different genres. And given sort of like your interest in paperbacks from hell, I think you would very much enjoy Scare Package.
Oh, totally.
So let's talk about the new one. The Final Girl Support Group. Do we have another deranged therapist to look forward to?
Yeah, there is a deranged therapist in it. Yes. God, yeah. I didn't even know I was doing that. But yeah, I mean, it's basically about, I just really love the whole Final Girl concept.
Yeah.
And, I was saying earlier about Friday 13 Part 2, and also a real mind-bending moment to me was Nightmare on Elm Street 3. When I saw that, I saw it in theaters. And when Heather Langenkamp shows up as the group therapist for the kids from that, I was like, whoa, character from a final girl from one horror movie showing up to be like the therapist for people in another horror. That's amazing. And so I really want to take final girls seriously because often they're sort of treated as like campy icons when they appear in pop culture. And I was like, these are people, the worst thing has happened to them. They're teenagers, they survived, then they got to live with that for the rest of their life. That's horrible. And so it's about a group therapy group for final girls, and they're 20 years past when this stuff happened to them, and the group's sort of fallen apart. Why are we still obsessed with stuff that happened in high school? And they all have different coping techniques. Some are ultra survivalists, others are sort of ultra denialists. And someone starts to kill them one by one, and the most paranoid member of the group is the one taking it seriously. And I didn't realize till I'd written the book and actually sold it to Berkeley, someone was like, oh, so it's Watchmen for horror instead of for superheroes. And I was like, oh shit, yeah, you're right. I hope I hope no one notices that, except now I'm saying it, so of course they will.
Well, you've got the spin on it too, though, right? Because they survive true crime kind of murders, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's like, it is like, oh, it's middle-aged horror movie final girls where someone's killing them one by one, and the only one who's convinced there's a killer out there is the paranoid, socially awkward one. And but I think it has it definitely has less rape than Watchmen. And I actually, as much as I love Watchmen, and which I really do, I'm a huge Alan Moore fan, I do actually think that the master plan in Final Girls holds up to a little more scrutiny than the master plan in Watchmen.
Okay. You also have a device, I wonder if it exists in this one. You don't do it in your film work, but you tend to do it in your literary work, is you do sort of like a Sunset Boulevard thing where you tell us the ending before, like at the beginning.
Trying to think. Yeah, well, that's one of those things books can do that I love, which is you got to hook people, you know what I mean, and keep them turning pages. So you can always hint or say what's happening later, just to keep them going. And I also really love framing devices because I love looking back on stories in retrospect. But in Final Girls, no, it is a pell-mell rush start to finish. It's really like, it's the closest thing to a bottle episode I've ever written. It starts in this week and it ends on that week, and the time is a real ticking clock. So no, it's totally straight on through.
Okay. So when you were doing this, you talk about some of the research you do, and then how you like put it together to go on the road to publicize the book. Sort of, what was the key piece of research that you did in terms of Final
Girls? Really, for me, the real key thing with Final Girls was writing it over and over again. Like, I really stayed away from Final Girl stuff. And in fact, I tried to sell this book. I wrote it first in like 2014, and I put it aside because I was writing Horror Store and then My Best Friend's Exorcism. And when My Best Friend's Exorcism was done, that was a 2-book deal. And I went to my publisher. I got this book, Final Girl Support Group. I cleaned it up, spent like 3 months cleaning it up, gave it to my editor, and literally it arrived in his office the same week as the press release for Riley Sager's Final Girls book came out. And he was like, I'm not going to buy it. Not even going to read it. Like, and I don't blame him. You know what I mean? Who wants a similar book? Even though they're really, really different, like Final Girls, the end. So I went away with it. I rewrote it again, and I wanted to do it instead of Southern Book Club. And I wrote Paperbacks from Hell. I wrote We Sold Our Souls. And I wanted to do it instead of Southern Book Club. And I was like, come on, time's passed. And he's like, nope, still not interested. And I was like, God damn it. And put it aside, did Southern Book Club. And then my manager was like, listen, I'm used to screenwriters who've got stuff to sell. He's like, books take too long. He's like, I need something to sell for me. Do you have stuff trunked? And I was like, well, there's this Final Girl thing, but everyone pretty much hates it. And at that point, I'd written it 3 times, and I gave it to him, and he's like, I can sell this. He's like, this is great. He's like, but you got to rewrite it. And I was like, all right. So I rewrote it again. And he managed to sell it to Annapurna for a TV thing. That option since expired. And then my literary agent, which I hadn't had before, who came on board, was like, "Oh, is this what you want to sell as your next book?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "I think you need to rewrite it." So I rewrote it again. And then it got bought. And then I did another big rewrite. And that last rewrite, which I did mostly in 2019 and 2020, that was that final 10% that turns it from something that's, oh, it's all right. And that's what happens with a lot of my books. That last rewrite, it's a bigger rewrite than people imagine. It always drives my editors crazy, but it's that last bit that makes it go from dead but fine to, oh, it's alive. And so living with this book for so long and rewriting it so many times and just avoiding all Final Girl media in the process, really just, I don't know, it did a lot for the book. It made me keep taking it seriously. It made me keep coming to it with a year, after not seeing it. It just made me keep looking at it with fresh eyes and be like, if you're going to take this seriously, you need to fucking take this seriously. And it really made me kind of not get away with stuff I was trying to get away with. It was sort of bullshitty shortcuts. And so I'm glad it didn't sell back in 2016 because it wouldn't be half the book it is now. And all kinds of things just crept in over time that just made it a better book. And one of the big ones was the sort of a story a friend of mine was telling me about someone they knew whose daughter woke her up and was like, "Mom, there's a man in the house with a gun." And this parent realized that the nightmares, the boogeyman for children now, it's an active shooter drill because you do
Mm.
those all the way back to first grade, basically. And that's become the nightmare for kids. There's a man in the house with a gun. And you look at
You,
slasher movies, which is there's a slow moving dude in a safe place, a school, a camp, a college dorm, and he is methodically moving through it and killing everyone he sees. And you're like, that is an active shooter situation. Like these slasher movies that became so cheesy and campy really like set this weird template for what we live with on a regular basis now. And so it was stuff like that just sort of filtering into the book or into my brain that was like, yeah, that helped the book tremendously.
you seem like a big process guy. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, I mean, the only way to write a book is to write a book, and the only way to write a
Yeah.
good book is to write it over and over again for me.
No, it's true. I agree. I'm here to confirm you.
I appreciate it. No, I'll take
I'm
all the
not a
validation I can
therapist,
get because
mind you.
it is a uselessly inefficient process.
Yeah, I think all writing is. I mean, unless I'm Jack Kerouac or someone.
Yeah,
But
it's
I
all
mean,
inefficient.
yeah, but I mean, his whole thing was about the inefficiency of the
Yeah,
language, right? Um, so let me just get some quick responses from you
yeah, yeah.
as we wind down here. Since you're talking about slashers, since you're interested in slashers, give me your top slasher movie or top slasher antagonist.
Oh well, I gotta say, transphobia aside, Sleepaway Camp's actually a really great movie. If you get, but I get that transphobia isn't for everyone. That transphobia though is apparent in so many slashers,
Oh
especially
yeah.
books. It's crazy. But so top slasher movies though, I don't think I love Halloween H2O. Don't think it gets enough respect. I also think Halloween 4 is tremendously underrated. Nightmare on Elm Street 3 looms large, but I got to say, Halloween 4 is a movie I think is also tremendously underrated. Um,
You know what's interesting about the Halloween series, real quick, as a diversion here. Halloween 6, the long game of, again, a therapist from the first one being the
yes,
leader of the demonic cult that rises Michael Myers like through
it is
necromancy.
such a weird, and that druid stuff first pops up in the novelization of Halloween 1 that Dennis Etchison wrote, which is so weird. And then he wrote like a version of Halloween 4, a screenplay that's not very good, where Michael Myers grows 30 feet tall. I mean, it's just so weird. He's powered by druids. It's bizarre. Um,
Well, druids are a big
but
deal in 3 too.
Yeah, exactly. But so yeah, Halloween 4 underrated, Nightmare on Elm Street 4 underrated. And I actually I'm not, I like the Friday the 13th movies, but I really have to say if there's one truly great slasher movie that's in a franchise, I would have to say Friday the 13th Part 2.
Okay.
It's such a sincerely good movie. And if there's one, to me, great slasher movie that isn't in a franchise, it's Black Christmas, which I think
Okay.
is still gives me sweaty palms, man. That's still a fantastic movie.
It's an interest. I mean, it is an interesting premise in that one, right? He's traumatized as a kid and then sort of like repeats it.
Yeah, but I also find that I find Christmas movies tremendously comforting.
Mm.
I find the Canadianness of it tremendously comforting. It's got John Saxon in it. Margot Kidder is phenomenal. I want to be her when I grow up in that movie. And the killer, his whole voice, his whole stuff on the phone, that eye looking through the crack in the door, I find that stuff. So the body with the plastic bag over his head just languishing in the attic, that stuff just sticks in my head. You know, it really, really does.
We had David Weiner on back in October who did the two In Search of Darkness
Oh,
documentaries.
yeah,
Um, and so I was thinking about you too, and I was watching part two of that because that just came out, and I was like, huh, this seems like a good one for Grady as well. I'm just going to
yeah.
give you a bibliography of things. Uh, but yeah,
And
it's
actually,
go ahead.
just to jump in, a movie that looms large for me that's terrible, and I encourage people not to watch it, is Pandemonium, which is one of those comedy slashers. And there were a couple of them: Student Bodies,
Yeah,
Pandemonium, that stuff. And they're all terrible. But Pandemonium, I saw as a kid and thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen in my life. It's not.
that's how I feel about Tammy and the T-Rex,
Yeah.
the real
Another
version,
movie
not the
that
edited version.
it's not good.
It's not, but it is, and
Yeah.
it's got oh, what's his name from Children of the Corn?
Yeah, yeah, I can't. But it's also Taming the T Rex is more entertaining than Pandemonium, to be honest.
Yeah, it's funny thinking about the different 80s movies in relationship to like how you experience them then and how you experience them now. Like I
Oh
can't
yeah,
watch Monster Squad anymore. I can't. But
yeah.
like as
No,
a
I
kid,
hear
I
you.
loved it.
Some still, like. I still will go down saying Red Dawn's a legit good movie,
Okay.
and I'm a fan of the Rocky franchise, even for.
Okay. We're fond of what I like to call horror blasphemies here. My horror blasphemy is that Halloween 3 is the best Halloween movie.
Yeah, no, but Halloween 3 is a fantastic movie. I think it's great. I just think it so stands outside the franchise. You almost have to think of it as a standalone.
Do you have a horror blasphemy for us?
Trying to think. I mean, yeah, I got one. I really
Okay.
don't like the Universal horror movies. I just,
Original ones or the
yeah,
what?
they just bore my tits off. I think the original Dracula is interesting from a textual point of view, but God, it's boring. The Invisible Man is tedious. Creature in the Black Lagoon, that is a sexy gill man, but that's about it. The only two that to me hold up are the Old Dark House and Bride of Frankenstein, which is
Okay.
great. But the rest of them, man, I can live
See, I'm a
without.
Mummy fan. I like the Mummy.
It's fine. And I don't really like the Hammer movies either. I
I
appreciate,
knew that. I knew
yeah,
that from Paperback from Hell.
I appreciate the aesthetic. I really do. And I like other movies that partake of that aesthetic, like Mask of the Red Death and stuff like that. But yeah, I just can't.
Did you
And
like
I
the
get
Hammer
it.
TV show?
Never. Oh, Chiller. Wasn't it
No,
Chiller?
it
No,
wasn't it.
Hammer's
No,
House of Horror.
yeah, Hammer's House of Horror. That
Never
got
saw
so
it.
violent they pulled it off the air.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have never seen it, and I should. But and here's the thing. I actually there are Hammer films I love. Cash on Demand, I think, is a fantastic movie. But I get why people like that aesthetic. It is just not my bag.
Okay. It sounds too. I mean, like in terms of your aesthetic, it's sort of like Americanized Giallo film.
A little bit, but also like, I love I really love House of Whipcord.
Okay.
You know, the Day of the Triffids TV show from the 80s, I'm a big fan of. Wicker Man, I still think is one of the greatest movies
The
ever made.
original.
Like the original, yeah. But you know, so I love that gloomy, rainy British aesthetic. You know, you just don't come across it that often.
Yeah. What apart from your own book, of course, what horror books, since you're a great consumer of them and once reviewed them, what horror book are you looking forward to this year?
You know, I mean, I'm about to read, I've got a copy of Stephen Graham Jones's My Heart is a Chainsaw, and it's slasher adjacent. So I've been putting off reading it till I've really been done with Final Girls, which I finally am. You know, copy edits and all that stuff. So that's the one I'm really psyched to read. I read so little
He's
new
coming on
stuff.
in October, actually.
Oh, he's a great guest. His stories are fantastic, and he's got, you know, my slasher identification is very new. Like these movies, I wasn't allowed to watch our movies, so I saw very few of them as a kid. And so, but Steven's been in love with these things from day one. And he is correct that he's a Friday the 13th buff instead of over a Halloween buff.
Mm.
Um, which
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
looking
is the
forward to
right
that one too.
choice.
Actually,
Yeah.
that would have been my pick too.
Yeah. I
Are
mean, the
you
Halloween is just the franchise that's like, they just said, we don't want any jokes in this franchise. We don't want any humor. Get rid of it.
clearly?
Stomp it out.
Are you looking forward to any horror movies coming out or horror television coming, or have you
I
seen
am
one recently
so,
that you would?
no, I haven't seen anything recently. I am so behind on stuff. I don't watch much TV, unfortunately. I'm reading stuff for work all the time, and most
Mm,
of it's old stuff. And so that really is what eats my life. It is a terrible, boring answer that makes me a boring human being.
that's fine. I want to email you in 6 months, and I want I want to get your opinion on the movie Violation.
Wait, what's that?
It is a film about it's a basically a revenge fantasy film, um, but it predicates around the idea of consent. That's all I'll
Oh,
say.
who's it from? And is it streaming now, soon?
Yeah, it is on Shutter.
Okay.
Um,
Oh, wait. Yes. I
it's
was
the
just
two
talking to them
directors
and
from
they,
Canada.
yes. I just was talking about that with, or someone was telling me about that. They were making it out to be slasher-ish, but much different. And I was like,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. It's
They
not.
were sort of lumping it in with Lucky as something that's sort of in that ballpark of a sort of revisionist kind of genre film.
I would. I mean, it's closer like I Spit on Your Grave,
Oh, great.
but more intimate.
Yippee. I Spit on Your Grave is one of those movies as a kid. I was like, I think it's a better movie than people give it credit for, but God, I hate it. I mean, it's just so boneheaded and stupid.
How I feel about Faces of Death.
Another one. Well, actually, Faces of Death is worse than people think it is.
Yeah, I mean, well, Faces of Death was like the equivalent of finding your dad's porn, right? Like
Yeah,
that was
except
the
less
mystique of
fun.
it. It was more like finding it was important,
Yeah,
not watching it,
yeah, exactly.
because it wasn't going to live up to, the weird hype you
Never
were
going
going
to
to
live up to his.
experience.
I mean, I talked about Faces of Death for years of my childhood and saw 15 minutes of it as in university, and that was enough for me.
Okay. My last question for you is, you have in development The Black Room, and I have no idea what this is, and it's the only title in your oeuvre that I could find that I don't have any idea what it is. So what is it?
So The Black Room's a script I wrote with a friend of mine, Nick Rucka, years ago for him to direct. And it's a really straightforward seance movie. There are these things that happen with these spiritualist sittings a lot, which is bunch of dudes who are scientists will go and investigate a female medium at some location, often her house. Usually takes a few days. And usually what happens is the investigation falls apart because basically the medium is really good at wrapping them around her finger, and she's smarter than they are, and they don't give her enough credit, and they always splinter into these she's a medium, she's a fraud kind of fights, and they really get personal and ugly. And so I wrote a movie that's about that. It's a one location, 6 actors, and Nick and I worked on this for years, and then it just sort of, he's an editor now, and it sort of got out into the ether, and it looks like though it's closer to getting made now than it ever has been. So, but it's funny, I pulled out the first draft of that to look at something for a legal reason, and it was 2009. Like, Jesus Christ.
Well, and also, I mean, like, you know, quite a few things are in development. You sold the rights to Final Girl before it was even finished,
Yeah.
right? You said,
And
and then
Horror Store is going to be a movie. I'm writing the script now. Southern Book Club's out
Southern
there
Book
for a
Club?
TV show. Yeah, stuff's around. My best friend's Exorcism shooting now. So yeah, I'm very, very
Going to be all Grady Hendrix
blessed.
for the next decade.
Oh God, people are gonna be so sick of me. I'm sick of me. And that's really what I've found is the problem with sort of virtual things is, I love meeting people. I like talking to people. I like listening to people, but I find the virtual thing, it's so one way. And then things like this end or virtual events end, and I log off, and I'm just a guy who's been shouting at my laptop for an hour in my office all alone. It's very depressing.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to depress you, Grady.
No, it's not your fault. I just mean like I don't know. I just it's these are harder than going out and doing them in person. Just I don't know. There's something about the medium. I don't know. It's weird.
It is. I mean, in my perspective, like teaching this way is very hard because it's
Oh, remote
completely
teaching.
unidirectional.
Remote teaching.
Yeah.
Oh, that must be such a drag, man. Like you can't. Can you even tell if they're paying attention?
No, because I mean, so you're just like lecturing your laptop essentially.
Oh man,
I mean, at
that
least
is
this way
right.
we're actually talking, you know?
Yeah, I take back my wine because that must be rough.
Well, you start to wonder sometimes if you are kind of going crazy because like, am I just talking to myself?
I mean, yeah. Does it ever do you ever feel like, or do they all just have me muted?
Yeah. Yeah, always.
That's hard. That's really, really hard.
So this to me is great because at least I know
Oh yeah,
you're paying attention.
Well, to me, this is so much better than doing a virtual event, because a virtual event, you aren't really interacting with anyone, even a little. It's all output, And so a podcast or an interview, that at least there's the back and forth. Absolutely. It just still is weird. Like, I don't know. I've spent more time staring at my laptop this past year than I have in like the previous 10 years put together. It's like, if this thing dies, I gotta get a new one like right away.
I'm going to go ahead and name your laptop Snoopy.
Oh, that's actually nice. I'll stick with that.
Kind of fits, right?
Yeah.
Full circle. Well, thank you so much, Grady Hendrix, for being here. For you out there, get your copies of the Final Girl Support Group out in July, I believe, July 8th?
July 13th.
July 13th. But yeah, thank you so much. I've enjoyed this conversation a great deal.
Oh, dude, no, this is fun. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And to you out there, stay spooky. Thank you for joining us on SunScream. Tune in next time for Kate Reed Petty, author of True Story.